Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Paul Hammant and Luc Courage. Based in Edinburgh, Paul is a consultant in the lean agile software delivery space who is most well known for his work on trunk-based development. You can follow Paul on Twitter at Paul_Hammant and check out his website at trunkbaseddevelopment.com, and of course, check out his book of the same name. Also based in Edinburgh, Luc is a lean agile consultant with 15 years of experience in product management and software delivery, agile delivery, digital transformation, and change management. Paul and Luc are the authors of the Leanpub book, Value Stream Mapping for Software Delivery Teams. In the book, Paul and Luc explain the concept of value stream mapping, or VSM, a powerful tool for software development teams aiming to improve efficiency, reduce waste of their day and weekly activities. Luc and Paul's book talks through the history of lean agile developments and the history of value stream mapping specifically, differences when it comes to software development, and comes with an app for you to use in whole stream VSM activities towards running experiments for improvements. In this interview, we're going to talk about their backgrounds and careers a little bit. Then we're going to talk in detail about their book. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about their experience writing and publishing. So thank you very much, Luc and Paul, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks very much for being here. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So Paul, why don't you go first and tell us a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into the career you have built for yourself?
So I grew up in southern England, wasn't choosing to go into software and IT, but I found my way there, as many people with an engineering direction ended up. And I started in mainframe development and then very quickly jumped to client server in 95, Java, all the languages through the 2000s. Then I rose up the org chart into management, found my way to America, a bunch of Fortune 500s. And then I, luckily, in the context of this lean-inspired value stream mapping, found my way to a fellow called Kevin Bear, who'd previously been co-author of the Phoenix Project, and his sidekick, Jade Bloom, and they taught me value stream mapping nearly 10 years ago now. And I've been using it ever since for process improvement in software delivery teams, as well as a bunch of other lean techniques. Then I found my way back to the UK, bumped into Scotland. It bumped into Luc at a Scottish employer, and we hit it off immediately. Very quickly agreed to write the book. It's taken 2 years. Or Luc.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Yeah. Moving around throughout one's career is kind of a sub-theme of our podcast, since I do ask that question about people's origin story. And I'm curious, what was your when you first moved to the States, where did you move to, and what was that experience like?
This was for ThoughtWorks. So I joined ThoughtWorks in London. So Martin Fowler's consultancy, quite a brain trust in the early agile days. We focused on extreme programming, which is the one with pair programming and test-driven development as the feature. And lots of people feeding off each other, making open source frameworks. Made a couple of my own, including Selenium, at least co-creator of Selenium. And you learn techniques, you exist in teams, they end up being high throughputs. You try and insist the client does stuff the agile way, they try and coerce you into doing it the waterfall way. We would always prevail, luckily for us. Many, many times, different languages, different verticals, banking, airlines. I was in the Google Test Mercenary teams in Mountain View for just under 2 years. That was a lot of fun, but a lot of privilege being there because they're nearly all smarter than me. I got to learn a lot of things that I've been dipping into the toolbox ever since to apply in enterprise, which is where I most often exist, and mostly looking at the existing products, software delivery organization, and helping them wind the handle faster without that being stupidly longer hours or other, falsy sort of techniques for getting better for less. So the idea is that we've got a whole bunch of techniques from Agile and Lean that we can apply. And then if we're smarter with picking software and the way we write tests and the way we write codes and the way we commit and the trunk-based development stuff, we can be a better high throughput delivery team.
Yeah, fantastic. And Luc, how did you find your way into your career and all your way up to Edinburgh?
So yes, I'm originally French, so that's not a Scottish accent. I grew up in the countryside, an hour away from Lyon, which is in the southeast of France. And well, a bit like Paul, I didn't study IT, so I wasn't planning to become a technology consultant. I actually studied business and finished my degree in Scotland. So that's why I'm still living there. And basically, yeah, I finished my degree during a financial crisis. So I had to choose between either staying in Scotland or moving back home and going back to my mom's. And well, if you think about it, moving back to your mom's once you've got a degree is not necessarily the definition of success. So I just decided to stay in Scotland for another year to give it a go, and got a graduate job in technology and innovation in utilities. Stayed there for a couple of years, and then I moved to the Scottish company Paul was talking about. And so, yeah, my first experience in technology was really waterfall. But then when I moved to that second organization, that's where I got my real first experience with what agile is, and really started at the bottom. I was implementation support specialist and made my way up to become basically product manager. So I got a lot of experience in product delivery. I'm not a technical person, so I try to do everything but the technical bit. And for the past 2 years, I've been a consultant at Capco and still working in financial services, and I'm still do the same kind of thing. So working mainly on project delivery, but I'm also an lean agile consultant. So I help team embrace new ways of working. And that's it.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. One question that comes up when I talk to people who are in the UK nowadays, who've sort of found their way there. I moved to London myself in 1999 and lived there for a few years, and had a great experience. One question I'd like to ask is if you had, well, here's a version of it. If you had moved back to your mom's in say 2008 or 2009, and you wanted to come back now, would it be as easy for you to do that now as it was back then?
I don't think we want to talk about Brexit. That's probably not the subject of that podcast, but obviously that would be much more complicated for me to come back here.
Yeah, no, I'm just asking as a sort of purely practical matter, because sometimes people are sort of like curious about like how easy or hard it is it to actually move, because we can make it sound easy, but actually the story behind it is often there's a lot of paddling underwater.
And to be honest, it would be pretty hard for me to move back to France because I've got a 3-year-old daughter now, so that would be quite complicated.
That can also complicate things. Yeah. So thanks very much for sharing that. It's so interesting to hear about your different backgrounds. I'm the sort of resident non-technical person at Leanpub myself, so I know exactly what you mean, Luc, when you talk about sort of like trying to sort of focus on the other things if you can, and the sort of challenges and opportunities and sort of like just fascinating things that come from that. Just moving on to the next part of the interview where we talk about your book, Value Stream Mapping. Luc, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history of process management and things like that you go into so well and sort of entertaining way at the beginning and even at the end of the book in the appendix.
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about process improvement, usually the first thing that comes to mind is Taylor's and Ford. Why? Because, before industrialization, really, there was no real room for process improvement because, most units were basically a single person doing everything from the beginning to the end. And therefore, there was not such a thing as dividing the work into smaller tasks and identifying how you can optimize each task. But with industrialization, we started seeing the birth of factories. And then we had people such as Taylor who started thinking about how they could actually try to optimize each task in order to increase the throughput, in order to get more items out of individuals. And that's really started. So when you think about Taylor, you think about standardization. It's about basically how can I get maximum effort with a minimum amount of movement. So I guess Taylor was probably the first contributor. The second one is Ford. Ford's contribution was really the ability to create the same Ford T in the minimum amount of time. And that's basically how we could afford to pay higher wages, just because the factory was so productive that other competitors couldn't compete because they didn't have the same efficient process. And then really, when we think about Taylor and Ford, we've got mixed views about them. First of all, it's true that they brought some massive improvements to the way we produce goods. However, they were not necessarily, they were treating people a bit like machines. They were trying to get the most out of people. They didn't want them to think too much. I think Ford said that he was wondering why every time he gets a pair of hands, they come with a brain attached. And it was probably working well until that point because, building a car in the 20s, 30s, 40s was a complicated process, but that's something you could divide into standardized tasks. However, if we think about what we're doing nowadays, software development or even writing a book, that's knowledge work. And it's much, much more complex. You don't really know what's coming next, so you cannot fully standardize the work. Which probably takes us to the history of value stream. So value stream comes from Toyota Production System. We can talk about Taichi Ono, but we probably not. We could probably spend the next 30 minutes talking about it. So basically, value stream mapping is a way to look at every step required to create a good. So that's value-adding steps and not value-adding steps. And the idea really is to be able to visualize your end-to-end process so that you can then identify where your issues are and drive process improvement. So again, that's a tool that comes from manufacturing, from Toyota, but we decided to adapt it to software development, and therefore we decided to follow a simpler process. So if you look at that standard manufacturing value stream mapping, you've got lots and lots of details because you have to be very, very detailed in manufacturing. In our world, it's just not possible to be as detailed. So we decided, first of all, to follow a simpler approach because we don't need the same level of details. But then we also wanted to create something that can be adopted by every software development team. So we don't want something that is created only for black belts. We want something that everybody can use. And basically, that's probably a very short summary of the history of value stream mapping, but that's where we are today.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. It was very clear. And it's when you say, it's a very, it could be a much longer story you want to tell. I mean, just to sort of pull on a couple of threads there, you talked about, the shift to industrial production of goods, and, the sort of, you invoked there the sort of really classic Adam Smith example of the sort of person who, say, produces the shoe, entirely themselves, and then switching to a process, there's actually 20 people making the shoe, and they're all cutting it up into different parts. But that doesn't just mean they make it 20 times faster. That means they make it 100 times faster because they can optimize little steps they're doing. And he talks about production of nails and things like that. But it's interesting you mentioned Ford. Sorry, not to digress, but it's interesting that you mentioned Ford complaining about having a brain come attached with the hands, because actually Adam Smith saw this problem from the other perspective. And he's like, why do I have these hands attached to my brain kind of thing? And he saw that, like, basically when people moved from kind of, being able to contemplate and talk and be in control of your day, making that shoe in your workshop, to the factory, they weren't going to have to know a lot to do that kind of work. And they weren't going to have a lot. Oh, look at that little hand showed up on my Zoom. And they were going to have something to occupy themselves with when they weren't working. And so this was actually one of the foundational arguments for public education, which is funny because a lot of people came to believe and do believe now that education is job training, whereas actually it was almost the opposite. It was to enrich your life. That was Adam Smith's argument, which is just so fascinating the way those things can get turned around. And that's just my admittedly digressive way of talking about how, like, there's so much that you very much know there is more to this story, and how fascinating and important these questions are in so many different ways. But yeah, so let's go on to what you've done. And one last thing I wanted to add, you've got this really great appendix where you sort of just talk very straightforwardly, like you just did, about how, like, the processes in manufacturing can all be seen basically, and there's often material like things produced, as a part of it.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of kinds of predictability and methods that come from that can then be applied to software development, with the caveat that there's all these differences. But the statement you guys make at the end of the book that I found so sort of refreshing and compelling is like, yeah, but that doesn't mean we should throw it all out and we should give up. There's software development is still developing something. Like, there's code and there's products and there's services at the end of that. So it's more like manufacturing than it is like a bunch of other things. And that's the sort of fundamental argument for why it's sort of like appropriate to take these manufacturing developed processes or
absolutely
process management systems and use them for software.
Absolutely. That's not a faulty production line, because every story is different, but we can, if variation is something we have to deal with, variability, the way we do things, we have to try to make it a bit more consistent. Because if you ask two teams to do exactly the same, to complete the exact same story, you will probably get two different outcomes. So, and one team will take less time than the other one. And at the end of the day, if you're going to charge a client for that, you have to make sure that basically you maximize the value delivered and you deliver it at a minimum cost.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to move on. So for those listening, we've got a diagram that we're going to be showing. There will be a link to in the show notes to an article on Leanpub where you can actually see this image and sort of follow along what we're talking about. But let me just share my screen here because the visualization is kind of key feature. Okay, here we go. All right. So now I'm sharing this visualization of the value stream mapping app. So Paul, why don't you walk us through what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so we have an app that came with the book. You would use this in a value stream mapping exercise with your own team, your dev team. And in fact, you could probably use it if you weren't in software, but we have a little language that's in a text area at the bottom. So for people listening and not looking, the little language is something like T for touch time, a space, and a way of describing the amount of time spent, in this case, half a day, which is 0.5D, and then an activity name, which is BA, which is business analysis. And then we have a wait time following that, W space 10D, means 10 days of wait time, and we carry on like that. And there's 2 or 3 or more of those, and then there's some defects described, D space dev, an arrow, BA, space 33%, meaning 33% of the things that flow through dev go back to BA for a reanalysis. And then this little language is conjured up using JavaScript into a SVG diagram of boxes and a quasi arrow, which is the wait time. The width of the box is proportional to the duration of the time that's described. There's legends in the little language are present in the boxes. So numbers are floating over things for durations, percentages are floating over lines going backwards, which are defects. And this is live. You would type into this in our app and it would repaint immediately above. And we have a way of maybe making it fit the width of the screen. There's a couple of strategies for that, real time and log 10. And your team would discuss it and say, look, this is describing our current process. And then there's something we'll come to later on, what you do with this information once you've captured it. But Luke and I would suggest that if we sat with a dev team and the psychological safety had been established, that team could probably spend an hour to draw this up reasonably accurately just from memory. Now, you could also, and Luke is adept at this, go off and scrape data from Azure DevOps to say, what are my transition times for each of these activities? And you might innately know what these numbers should be in this application. But if you steal the thunder of the dev team and fill it in for them, they detach, detune, start thinking about supper, et cetera, et cetera. So what we've done is captured one here just for the sake of discussion. So it's half a day of business analysis, 10 days of wait time. That means a Jira has been written up and is now sitting in Jira waiting for dev to start on it. Then there's development, 1 day average for each of the stories that would flow through that. Then there's 5 days of wait time. Then there's 2 days of quality assurance. And, then we have the lines going backwards. So that's the diagram we're looking at. And if this was Luc or I that were overseeing this in an exercise to the team, it's not enough for us to be able to take informed decisions. It may not be even complete or correct. So we would probably try and ask some questions of the assembled team. Now that we've established psychological safety, we would probably try and ask some questions of that team to try and work out if we've got the right numbers here and if there's any other factors that would play into that.
Yeah.
So we could do some role play here, Len, if you like. You could imagine yourself as a product manager, project manager, scrum master, delivery manager, and you could imagine that you're about to answer questions for your team and that Luc and I are asking those questions of you. Do you want to give that a go?
Yeah, sure. Let's go ahead.
So let's ask you immediately, how many developers do you have?
10.
10 developers. So all the time, the devs are developing. When they're not attending other meetings, they're picking up stories that are allegedly ready for dev in Jira or Trello or whatever your tool is. And they're taking an average of one day to complete them and pass them downstream. We do know that goes to QA, but frankly, the devs just mark it as dev done. So 10 developers are working on that activity at the same time, on average. So guess what our next question is, Len?
I can't guess.
It's how many QAs do you have?
Oh, how many QAs do we have? Let's say 2.
Okay. So we maybe note that ourselves. We might even add it to the descriptions here. And then the last question that's clear on this one is, how many BAs do you have?
1.
Okay. So Luc's got some additional questions that we could pose here that we can just see that's stuff that's self-evident to us, but would be thought-provoking for your team.
Okay.
Absolutely. So I guess the first question we would ask, because we're talking about value stream mapping and theory of constraints. Theory of constraints is about understanding where your bottleneck is. So first question, where do you think your bottleneck is here?
I think the bottleneck is QA.
And why is that?
I think that the 2 QAs and the 10 devs have a somewhat antagonistic relationship with each other, where the devs kind of feel superior to the QAs and don't like getting feedback back. And it's sort of like a pretty normal human thing where like they just relate to the QAs as people who find their mistakes and that they're afraid of getting blamed for it.
Look, just for the record, we're not talking about Leanpub development now, right?
No,
This is hypothetical.
No, not in the least. No. I'm making this up.
Okay. Sometimes that's the case, right? So devs are wondering why QA takes so long to do things. Now, in this
Just
case,
for the record,
go on, Luc.
Just for the record, we should say that QA was the correct answer, but it's the correct answer because you need 2 days, so that's your longest activity. So that's why it's your bottleneck.
Oh, I see from this diagram, right? Yeah. Got it.
Absolutely.
But if you added more QAs, right, that 2 days doesn't necessarily change, but the 5 days might change between dev and QA. So you deplete the backlog, whatever that means.
I see.
So you might still look at your 2 days of QA and say that is taking too long. How can we make that itself faster?
And I guess breaking the role play though, like so what? Well, okay, let's not break it down and say, well now that I understand this diagram a bit better, that you've explained it's the 2 days in the QA column at the end of the process that's the bottleneck. What about the 10-day wait time in between the business analysis that sort of receives some feedback from the QA and from the devs? There's a 10-day wait time. What's going on there?
So sometimes the BA started before the devs started, like weeks before, and they've built a massive backlog of allegedly ready to dev stories. So that's kind of waterfall, which is the other methodology that Agile would be pitted against. And that could be a mistake, or it might not have been accrued at the beginning of the project. It might just be constantly there as 10 days that the BAs are keeping a buffer of 10 days worth of stories, cards, PBIs, that the devs could start. But if you look at, there's another number, Luke, there, Len there, that's telling, which is the 33% that blows backwards.
Right.
Devs are either within seconds of picking up a story, halfway through, or when they're nearly finished, they're saying, I can't finish this, or we can't finish this. We need to ask BA to take this back. So it's not simply a quick chat and a moment of clarification. This is like, look, we can't do this. We're just going to suspend this work somehow, or scrap it. If you were in a production line and there was a defect in a headlamp, you wouldn't try and repair it. You might have done in the 70s if you were Jaguar. But in 2024, if you're on a car production line and there's a defect in a headlamp, it gets scrapped. Now, the 33% of these stories, 1/3 are blowing back to BA, and they might go faster than the 0.5 days, 3.5 hours that the BA spent originally on it to repair the story, to now send it back down a stream again another day or another week for inclusion in the next iteration. But it's nonetheless, it's 33% of them are going backwards. So you can make an equal claim that this value stream shows that the BA process is capable of being improved. And then how is sometimes a lot of conversations. But that 10-day buffer is definitely something you don't necessarily want in a high throughput, small cycle time value stream.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the idea is that you're gonna want some kind of buffer. So like, it's not like you want to reduce this to zero, because if it was reduced to zero, then you'd end up with developers with nothing to do from time to time. So you want to have a buffer, and so the arrows that are going back are not just in my head, they represented feedback, but I'm now understanding that they represent a sort of defect, either in what was passed on from left to right, or that's something that just sort of doesn't make sense, like say sort of like contradictory features or something.
Yep. Or we can't do that, or this is impossible, or a conversation like, do the users want this? Really? You know, like a radio dial rather than a slider in a page. And then there's a conversation and someone says, no, this is wrong, let's redo it. So it goes back, it's kicked out. Devs suddenly, mid-iteration, unexpectedly pick up another card from Jira that's ready for dev.
Actually, I've got a question about that. So to continue the role play. So I have this problem that maybe you guys can help me with my developers, where that 33% that's being kicked back to BA, some of that is because they question whether or not users would really want the feature. How much power should I really be giving them to do this? Because, you know, the typical user is not a programmer, and you know, there's such a thing that you know, I sort of cheerfully and with friendship and positivity call engineer brain, where people will say, you know, I can't see a use for this, as though that's somehow proof there's no use for it. So how can I mean, but of course you also don't want to be alienating people from their own work and telling them you completely don't understand what you're doing here. Just do what you're told. It'll be all right in the end.
Do you have business analysts in your development team?
No, it's just pure developers. They just work.
And the product owner, right? This is potentially you. So if this was trading, right? This was a team I was in 18 years back. We had the business analysts because our devs would have simply been unacceptable if they'd met the traders. Traders would say, who are these people? They can barely speak. They can barely dress. The devs would say, those people are rude, obnoxious at times. So you have some suited and booted business analysts that can sit in between the two groups and do translation in both directions. You know, maybe even explaining imperatives and, you know, wishes, intents. And they keep it calm. But only when the vertical, in that case trading, is sufficiently complex that you require that translation and you want to pay for that role within the team. So the team I was in years back had 8 devs and 2 BAs. And it was to liaise on what it was the trading people wanted in this very complicated application and translate it into developer acceptable language for consumption and delivery. And that did, in fact, also incorporate a fast serve message passing. Like they'd go back and say the devs don't think that rotating affordance is following conventions for other applications they built for other verticals. And then maybe, the BA can go and explain that. But to your question, you do want to empower people to speak up and say, are you sure this is what they want? But you want to be able to assert ultimately that it is, and perhaps with evidence is your arbitrator there. Do you have a UX, maybe not full time, but does a UX appear every now and again, once a quarter, to help you define the next roadmap? Could be sketches, whiteboard doodles, more likely Figma these days. But do you have somebody that can give the larger vision that hasn't been codified and broken up in stories, but does at least hint at experience that is broader than the actual story or epic you're currently working on? So arbitration on dev teams is hard, especially when in the modern age, we have a modern feeling that dev teams should try and be autonomous as much as they can be in a larger management structure. But it's a tension, please, I want you to do this. No, we don't think we should, and how do we find a place in the middle?
And is it probably a mistake for me to have meetings with both the QA and with the business analyst? Is it probably a mistake to have the devs and the QA people in the same meeting at the same time, because that might be causing them to...
Is that meeting estimation, or is it sizing of the iteration we're about to do?
No, the one I was thinking of where the developers produced something, the QA people found bugs with it, and they're both reporting back to the business analyst in the same meeting.
The devs and QA should probably have the same summary about the alleged defects before they face the business. So what the business doesn't want to see is discord within the dev team, normally why BAs are appointed, so that you are hidden from the discord. But you want maybe BAs and devs to agree the nature of the defects or not, settle it, and then if you're in the delivery lead role, modern name for Scrum Master, then you've got the ability to take that JIRA and say, hey, customer, I know you spoke to our BAs last week and we thought we understood and we could deliver this, but we have actually found a defect that should give us pause for thought. So watch out. Tomorrow, one of the BAs is going to come by your desk and talk to you again about it, trying to explain our distilled wisdom on it. So, it's very considered language in order to not scare the customer, but to understand they have to re-engage on the same topic. And in this age, we don't allow raised voices. We don't allow tone anywhere within the team. And if there's a likelihood, sometimes traders are going to be like that. If there's a likelihood of that, the people that have to kind of take that sufferance is BAs and delivery leads. And then when they go back to the devs, they say, oh yeah, the traders were fine with that thing that you described that we couldn't do, even if that's a lie. I'm guessing, don't have everyone in the same room if you haven't settled the entire summary of what the incident, defects, rejection is.
And it's one thing just looking at this diagram. So there's sort of three types of activities here, business analysis, development, quality assurance. Could I add on the end a fourth activity, which would be customer research, for example?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that could be upstream though, right? So that's, so if you think of this as left to right, so when we talk about shift left in our industry, we're hinting at there's things to the left of BA that we and Luke haven't codified in this diagram.
I see that. Okay.
Let's say it's you, right? And you're at breakfast, you got the kids and we're going to get them dressed in a minute and out the door to school, but you've suddenly thought of a new thing that we can do around, you and me talk about structured vector graphics sometimes. There's a new thing we could do around SVG that would be really awesome for Leanpub published books. However, you don't say a word, you don't write it on a post-it note, you don't pretend to your domestic partnership situation that there's anything other than family being thought about now. Unless you did think about it and you tried to file it away somewhere, and you're in the really cheap cost of mistake here because you haven't written it into JIRA yet, but you hope to when you get into work, so to speak. Customer research is a thing, and ideas, A/B testing. how do we get things in front of customers? I was in a bank once that was going to launch itself on mobile first, and the founder, this is the U figure then, would walk with laminated sheets of A4, what's it, 8x11 in the States, and it had a picture of a Android screen here for a bank app and another one which was an alternate view, and he'd show both to the customer on the street and say, which one would you like to use? And depending on the enthusiasm of the person in question, he might even sign them up as an alpha tester in that market research. So there's some really cheap things you can do around customer research that are far left of actual development work. And this isn't a dated before Figma, so this was all doodled in Visio or something like that, or maybe even Biro and felt tip pen.
Can we quickly circle back to that 10 days period you were talking about, Len? There's one thing we haven't discussed, and that's the way we schedule the work. So let's say, for example, that you work on a 4-week sprint. That means some of the items will be picked up on day 1, because that's the first day of the sprint, and some will be picked up on day 20, which is the last day of the sprint. So if you take the average, you probably arrive to something that is around 10 days. So actually, by having shorter sprints, and even by moving to a Kanban, you will remove those waiting time. So I think that's another interesting concept to consider.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, because the sort of like, it's particularly the kind of thing I've been exposed to. 20 days is a really long. I mean, in some things that's not long. In my world, that's a very long time. So many things will have changed that actually, like, the prioritizing of things would be the most important thing I'd be preoccupied with going into this kind of delay period. Would be like, I'd really want to make sure I put things in the right order.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at your 5 days in terms of waiting between dev and QA, if you only release work for testing every week or every 2 weeks, your waiting time will increase. So again, there's something you can do here if you have a good CI/CD pipeline, and if you just release whenever the work is ready to be tested.
We've skirted around but not talked about it specifically, but QA is quality assurance. It's an age-old activity that involves test plans and a bunch of training and a whole career progression. But at some point 10 or 20 years ago, the effort started to become quality engineers. So the people who previously would have had to follow the test plan and been very good at finding things the devs couldn't find, by clicking and playing with applications and even hardware in the cases of a phone app. We had to now run the likes of Selenium and other automated testing tools that are within the purview of the quality engineering team. So that 2 days might, in a team that had never done any quality engineering before, become 3 days as they attempted to do exactly the same engineering work in the name of test for the same card, story, or PBI. But if they were super skilled and they built a wealth of reusable components and previously existing automated tests, that QA duration on average per story could come down from 2 days to 1 day, because we've engineered some really smooth reusable bits and pieces, page objects and the like, that allow us to become super adept at seeing the quality step completed by a team that wasn't themselves developers. So the tools can change in order to make an impact on this overall cycle time.
Yeah, that's reminding me of something. I'll probably put this in a naive way, and you can correct me and kind of put it in the right direction. But I was interviewing someone recently who was talking about digital twins. For anyone who might not be familiar with that idea, that concept, you can have a kind of virtual representation of an actual object out in the real world, and the virtual object can be getting sensor data from that object in the real world. And so you can actually use this to sort of measure things that are happening to the object out there in the real world, things like that. And then you can modify the digital twin in a virtual environment to sort of see how it would operate if you made changes to it, things like that. And he made the point that, like, every Tesla out there has a virtual twin, has a digital twin, and that there's sort of real time information coming back from all of these things out there in the real world all the time, and that they can actually use that information to model changes Like if they find that there's something process that, like, well, let's just say a fault. There's a fault with something. They can actually use this to virtually modify their production of that part, say, and test that in a virtual environment, and then roll it out in the factory, like, within like sometimes hours or sometimes days and things like that. So this is, I guess I'm just, the high level thing is these are all very human business analysts, developers, quality assurance or quality engineers. Where does the virtual, as it were, kind of like machine kind of feedback come into a process like this?
So, I mean, you talked of digital twins, which sounds a bit using telemetry from running systems to bring stuff back to mothership, wherever the HQ is for Tesla, to allow them to say, no, autopilot wasn't on during that crash and things like that, So stuff that's important, not just for fine-tuning the production line or running experiments on software reboots. Now, in regular software, say we're making a website, say it's a shopping website for an airline, which is still a significant business. We might have service virtualization going on. Martin Fowler would write about test doubles, of which there's like 6 or 7 shades of that. But if the thing is major and it's far away and you deal with it over TCP/IP, you might do service virtualization to completely mock out that far away thing in a number of very expected ways for the sake of test scenarios. And if you're writing the shopping carts and the inventory is a mainframe somewhere very far away, but you're the shopping cart team and that's all you're concerned with, you might have a number of scenarios, say 50 scenarios of attempts to purchase something in the inventory, and some of those 50 will fail and some of them will pass because they're set piece tests. So in the QA world, at least, we could have some faraway things that we could virtualize. In the dev world, because they still write their tests too, those tests would be unit tests. They might use far smaller, far more immediate forms of test doubles, as Martin would call them, to help them mock out some pieces that are not key to the unit they're testing or the thing they've just changed. So we do use test technologies to have a massive positive impact on this entire value stream. And that didn't start recently. That was from the 90s onwards. I think the first unit test framework was S-Unit for Smalltalk. Kent Beck and Eric Gamma, I'm not sure. And, soon after that, they ported that to JUnit. And then, Java was on its own for a couple of years as a model language. And then it was joined by .NET and Ruby. And although Ruby and Python are older than Java, they came to the fore through the 2000s. And now we have, it's a flower race between some 12 or so languages. And every one has their own testing technologies. Some of them are repackagings of, say, Selenium. But some of them are unique to that technology. And a team might say, we could make dev quicker if we use this better for us testing technology. And a QA team could say, if we shift from, say, and it happens, people say they want to stop using Selenium and start using Cypress, they could make a claim, and I might disagree, that it's faster or better somehow for their toolchain. So all the time, people, dev, QA, even business analysts are thinking about alternate tools to try and bring this value stream shorter, increase lower cycle times, lower lead times, and they use technologies as well as techniques in order to achieve that.
I'm just going to stop sharing for a second here, or maybe for the rest of the interview, because we've had that image up for a long time and people can have it available anyways, just so people can see our faces as they're watching. But so this is a question that I've asked of a few guests on the podcast before. But imagine I'm in my business. I've been running my business for a while, and I've been doing waterfall, and I'm very comfortable in that space. And you come in and you show me this, and I say, what, how can I implement this in my team? Like, how am I going to lose a lot of time switching?
I think you probably didn't start with a value stream in order to make your decision to jump from waterfall to agile for the first time. I think it has possibly been a long thought. if you're government or if you're semi-states or if you've got some systems that were first coded in the 70s or 80s that are still going, then you might still be in that waterfall world. But you'll go through a very large planning exercise to make the first foray into agile before you even get to lean, which is like a speed up on, tweaking improvement on agile ways. And you might have been planning that for a while and chosen one small component of your larger system. I'm holding my hands up for the audio listeners. And you might start with that one and say that team's agile and we're all releasing together every 3 months, but that team has actually got several little releases inside our legacy application's larger release cycle. And then you gain some experience and you say that's successful and we're going to try a second component or service team. Or you could choose a microservices strategy and say we're going to tease one service at a time out of a larger legacy monolith mainframe application. Could be rewrite, most likely is, in something newer and younger as a technology than COBOL. And you're likely at some point to say we're now a functioning agile team, several of us coordinating or not on a release cadence. That one of there's a methodology called Scrum, which has a turbo button press that you can do on it. Some would say that called safe, that allows you to do far bigger things with Scrum. Now, some of us say maybe it's not that good versus the claims, but people keep trying it. And you could say that maybe value stream mapping is a technique that a team that has got to some overall agile way of working, but are wishing for better or more smaller, tighter cycle times. Maybe value stream mapping is for them to experiment with, to see where they can find their safe to fail experiments that might pay off on an improvement in some way.
I think that's,
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, what Paul explained is very important. When you want to transform your organization, you have to start somewhere and you need to find the right team. You need to find that team who wants to innovate, who wants to try new thing, because you need that kind of social proving. We have to prove that it's possible to move from a waterfall approach to agile, and they have to make it exciting for the rest of the organization. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging. You will always find people who don't want to change because, we've got that kind of status quo bias. But change is the only constant at the end of the day. And you have to find the right team who's going to make it possible for the organization to basically experiment and slowly move from waterfall to agile.
That's really fascinating. You just reminded me, I had Jeff Sutherland, who was one of the co-creators of Scrum, on the podcast not too long ago. And he talked about, he's got a few origin stories, as I gather, for like where Scrum came from. He's done so much in his life. And one of the sort of inspirations was his work sort of training fighter pilots in Vietnam. Long story short, watch the podcast if you want to see the whole thing. But he basically said, he was very dark at a certain point. He goes, some people would rather die than change. And so that point that you just made, Luc, about how like you need to have someone who wants to change within an organization first. Start there, find those people, and from what I understand, there will be people somewhere in an organization who want to change. But as Paul has brought up many times, having a kind of environment of safety in some way that you've developed, so that people can maybe know they are the only one who wants to change, but you give them the space to experiment. You give them some techniques, or you give them some sort of like publicly available, I don't know, kind of process that they can name and adopt and then use within like, a sort of small subset or something of the organization as a way to do it. Just very generally, since I've got you guys here, imagine, I mean, I'm sure you might get this all the time at, the sort of Thanksgiving dinner or the pub table or what have you, but someone goes, hey, so you guys, there's this long history of process management going back to Adam Smith, and, there's Toyota production lines, and there's skyscrapers and aircraft carriers and stuff like that. But here in Canada, we can't even build a payment system for our federal government employees. It's been a scandal. And like, this is actually I'm not making that up. Like, there's an actual huge scandal and it was just a simple payment, but from the outside as a simple payment system. And they've spent, I don't know how much money on it, lots, and it's still kind of broken, and there's lawsuits and there's people not getting paid and stuff like that. So how is it that we can have, at the same time, like nuclear submarines and then people who can't make payment systems? What's going on there?
So engineering is interesting, and maybe for stuff that involves building things, literal physical things, there's different ways of working. There's different pieces of software you can use to build a submarine, nuclear reactor, or a skyscraper. And maybe those things are so well known, like the buckling strength of steel of a certain class, that there's lots of computer simulations you can do on your design before you get to inevitably your waterfall build out of the same. But here's the thing, right? So I did a blog entry after an argument with somebody in the QA community. They lamented and said, why can't we write software like we build buildings? And the answer is we don't have to, because software is weightless. And my blog entry, the thesis of it was, if we were building the Empire State Building, again, using my hands, and it's like a big thing like that, and we regretted the foundations, whilst it's being worked on every floor, some of them being painted and decorated, we can lift it up, change the foundations in software, and then place it back down again gently on its new foundation, and not one worker had to slow up on their activity towards the, in skyscraper terms, they call that top out. We have the ability, because it's weightless, to destruction test everything 1 billion times before we ever go live with our CI technologies and our CD habits into environments at the end of a commit, with a few humans saying no on that process. Our ability to add tests, unit tests, Selenium tests, the whole thing can be destruction tested. And whilst that does cost, cloud dollars, it's inconsequential compared to developer salaries. Or there's a translation figure where you say, oh, of course, we'll do as much CI and CD as we can and scale up and parallelize that test automation. Yeah, we'll test Android and web and iPhone all at the same time. And they can't do that in the hardware production world. So they need different techniques for that. So maybe they do prototyping if you're making CPUs, sampling some samples are sold back to us on AliExpress. But, in software, we can give it a go of testing it and destruction testing it and have a really high confidence that it's suitable for purpose. We can redo that. We can scrap it with cost and rewrite components of a larger system that are not themselves being scrapped. So we have a whole bunch of other techniques that we can use in the software world to make this. Now, to your question, your government product, and we have one in the UK here. Luc doesn't feel too embarrassed about this, him being a Frenchman and me being English, but we have a post office piece of software called Horizon that was made by a British company, ICL, who Fujitsu went and bought. And somewhere between ICL management and Fujitsu management, they got into a coercive situation where a developer or a practitioner or an individual contributor in a team would say, we're not going to be ready on date or on time or on quality, or this is wrong, or it's got defects in it, I need to. But the manager above and the manager above them and the manager above them would coerce them into saying, you're going to go live with that. It'll be okay. We'll fix the bugs afterwards. And perhaps they didn't, because some of them existed 10 years. And what we had in the UK was a whole bunch of people prosecuted for taking money off their balance sheet that they had to settle up at the end, net off at the end of every night. And they were prosecuted and imprisoned and fined. And in a couple of cases, they committed suicides. So now we have a big scandal and an inquiry, but it's all born from that bad place where it wasn't safe for somebody to say we weren't ready, or something bigger like we've chosen the wrong technologies, or we have the wrong people, perhaps, is a claim that could be made. But in reality, it's most likely the wrong techniques, the wrong trust, safety, structure for someone to whistleblow within a team. And some people would join this dev team and then quit within months because they knew it was going to be a massive career suicide to stick around with, and that nobody was going to listen in their fifth attempt to say this isn't ready. So this management coercion to fit dates or budgets, to meet bonuses, maybe if that's selfish, but also maybe to curry favor with the higher ups, is the reason that software goes off track so many times, and it's so frequent. And one of the intents that's called out in the values for Agile is that we're going to make it safe for people to talk up on the way we work. And I think the value is people over processes. And really, from the 90s onwards, we've been trying to live that within our world to test and experience that trust of feedback so that we can say we're not ready and we're not going to be screamed at. And if we do that more frequently, which Agile suggests, we get a better forward prediction that we're not going to make the date in 9 months' time, rather than with waterfall. We get to 1 week to go and we tell our customer that we're not going to make it, we need another 6 months. So that's the difference from Agile and waterfall, of which, Agile is really a subchapter of Lean. Lean is far older than Agile. Yeah.
And to circle back to value stream mapping, that idea of psychological safety is key, because if you're asking people to describe how they do things, they have to give you the right numbers. Otherwise, your value stream mapping will just be incorrect and you will then focus your effort on the wrong thing. So again, starting with psychological safety is absolutely key. And well, that's what Google told us 10 years ago with Project Aristotle. What they told us that the number one predicator of team performance is psychological safety. No,
that's really interesting. That one sort of like track that I go down sometimes, it's sort of fascinating psychological one, is that this distinction that we often make between sort of software and hardware starts to break down in certain places, like a famous scandal at Boeing not too long ago. And yet there's still something like, I think it's more, when we're talking about management coercion, right? Like, and where does that come from? And of course it's like bonuses, it's reputation, it's career, it's impatience, it's sometimes just the enjoyment of being coercive, which is not something to dismiss as a real force out there in the world. But there's something, I think, that like for almost all of us, we would not let a defective part through a process, like a defective physical part, because we kind of know that means the plane's going to fall out of the sky. But when it comes to software, there's something there that we're just inclined to let things go more than we are with physical things. Do you know what I mean? That's just this intuition that I've always had, that like there's something, it's easier to let it go. We'll fix the computer problems later.
I think it's not, I don't think it's that. Okay. I think it's a naivety to think, maybe my small ego's chatting to me that I think I've just written a unit, a class, a component, a module, and I go, I think that's it. I think that's good enough. I think, I've nailed it. Actually, I'm really good. And then I tell the project manager, I've done that. I'm ready for my next story now. But it wasn't, right? Because I hadn't done sufficient testing. So Agile at one level is for truly lazy people who are not absolutely perfect box tickers and 110% completers. Agile is a technique for us to lift our bar on capability and in pairing, definitely. And then test-driven development, one of the pieces of extreme programming, absolutely. We write tests and we still might have the small ego talking to us and saying, I don't write defects. But you know what? My own test showed that I did. Like weird things, like you're trying to got a bank balance and you try and say, I can't withdraw more than I have in my bank balance through the ATM. So you write a test that attempts to start with a zero balance and see if you can withdraw $10. And the test should fail. And you go, well, the test didn't fail. Blimey, I nearly told Vipul that I'd finished this story and I was ready for the next. And it's like, okay, so whoops, I think I'll just quickly, I'll be late for lunch, but I'll just fix that bug. And now I'll tell Vipul it's finished. And actually I'm as good as I tell everyone I am at development. So, we use these tools, unit tests for one, to destruction test things forever. The unit test I write now, just before my lunch, is going to run 10,000 more times in its life. It'll outlive me in the same company. But I write it to actually double check inner voice thinking that I'm really good at development, and it turns out I'm not. Not without tests. So we have a whole bunch of other techniques we can use in software that we should use. But if we're truly lazy, like we're working for ourselves on a thing and it's out there and it's not production worthy, but it's just for a blog entry, we cut corners and maybe don't write tests. But we know that we should. That's what the guilt says to us. It's the tests that make me safe. It's the tests that allow me to say that the plane door's not going to jump out in the ascent because nobody tightened the bolts properly. But we're not anything other than overconfident, I don't think.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's a really good answer. I'm gonna think about that more when I think about this kind of issue. I can't really think of a good segue, so I'm just going to straightforwardly say it. Why don't we move on to the next part of the interview where we talk about your process writing as co-authors. I'm really curious to hear about how you've been working on the book for quite some time. How did you, we had already came up that, Luc wrote this part and you helped, sort of edit it, Paul, and things like that. How did you plan the whole thing out in advance? Did you then divvy up chapter by chapter to each person and then edit each other's work? How did you go about doing that?
Go for it, Luc.
Sure. So first of all, writing the book was Paul's idea, so I'm not going to take the credit for that one. It was my first book. Don't know if I will ever write another book again. It was
or you'll be better at picking a co-author, right? Next time.
Exactly. I'll choose ChatGPT over you next time. No, honestly, it was a very interesting experience. Again, first book. I never wanted to write a book that was not on my bucket list. But Paul came up with that idea. So as Paul explained, we used to work together. We used to basically do value stream mapping together with some of the teams we used to work with. And I don't think Paul wanted to write a full book himself. So that's why he asked me to help him. And really, we didn't have a plan. We knew that was a great idea. We knew value stream mapping as it's being used in manufacturing was too complicated. And therefore, we wanted to share our knowledge with the rest of the industry. So Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we probably had the first session where we kind of created a skeleton of things we wanted to do, and then we kind of divided and conquer, where I started working on the sections, you started working on a different section. And our first version was actually a Google Doc. So we were both working on the same file. And once we were advanced enough, we decided to move to another platform because I think Google Doc wasn't compatible with Leanpub. But I don't know if you want to take it from there.
Yeah, sweet. I told Luc we might have to change it at some point to Markua. But I'd forgotten from the first book some of the technical stuff, and I believed there to be a translation tool that would take your Google Doc and turn it into Markua so we could get it in Git. And there wasn't. So it was way more manual activity and like experimentation with stupid plugins for Google Docs, and then attempting to use Pandoc and others on the command line to do it. It wouldn't work. So in the end, it was just a large, elaborate series of cut and pastes into content.md in Git, fitting the book, starting with the book templates, and then iterating from there. Other small snafus, the diagrams, and late in the game, we decided we're going to write an app, and I wrote that. And then we thought we're going to use, instead of using doodling tools on the Mac for diagrams, we were actually going to flip everything to use the app for our own diagrams. So it's not quite dog fooding, but you've no ability in the Leanpub toolchain to consume running web applications. So we had to use Selenium and Python to open up the app, program it to a certain value stream, like we've used one today, and then snapshot the center of that, just the rectangles and lines, snapshot that into a PNG, and then use that within the figure system, checking those PNGs in. So that ended up working quite well. but it was a bunch of dev work on a book. And of course, these are rabbit holes that I will happily go down for an eternity, being a techie. And Luc, being management, is busy, Gallic tutting, as I'm like off in the weeds on some of these very niche problems to solve. But we got there in the end, and we're very productive now within our Markua Git toolchain. Not mucking around with branches, we're just committing straight to master. Occasionally there's a clash, and I had to teach Luc all the Git skills, including merge arbitration. But it's been fairly smooth since we shifted. But again, this book was maybe a year longer than we thought it would take us to do. Maybe more than a year longer than that.
I think if we had to create a value stream of a book writing process, we would have a lot of wait time.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks, I would do a lot of writing, and then I wouldn't write anything for a month or something like that. But I guess it's probably the standard process. And we are not professional writers. We've got jobs to do as well.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. That's such an interesting journey. I mean, every journey is sort of different for everybody. And that's really sort of fun to hear that from you, Paul. That one thing about Leanpub that it's been interviewing authors so many times over the years. So many of them are programmers, and we'll actually find like the incredible things that they've done, like stayed up all night to make a tool to solve a problem and stuff like that. It's sort of like the sort of best kind of the best kind of authors to have on the platform in some sense. But sometimes there's like so much that we could have done to help, for example. But programmers want to solve problems themselves usually. And so like quite a lot of Leanpub features come out of like an author going off to try and solve their own problem, coming to us and saying, look how I solved it. And we're like, oh, that would be great to be able to sort of do something like that for all Leanpub authors. So that's really interesting to hear. This is sort of deep Leanpub history. We used to have a Google Docs writing mode where you could write in Google Docs and kind of like round trip or what have you. But it was just too difficult to maintain. And that's like when you talk about sort of integration with other apps and things like that, there are writing tools that allow this, but we might go there in various ways, like particularly since so many books have code in them, for example, there's better ways of doing it than we currently do it in a sense, but like the kind of like, hard line between like where you're building and running your code and then actually putting it into a book and publishing that. It has a value of its own to some extent. The last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest or guests are Leanpub authors, is if there was one magical feature we could build for you other than what we've already discussed, or if there was one thing that just had you shaking your fist, damn you Leanpub, over and over again that we could fix for you, can you think of anything that you would ask us to do?
Oh, I mean, it's all okay. You're rolling out features, and I'm appreciative of it each time you do. I don't have a big roadmap for you all to do, and really, if I did, you should ignore me.
Well, if you can ever think of anything, you've got my email. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
I mean, you know full well that I'm happy with the emails in your chat.
Oh, there might be one actually. So when I shared the link on LinkedIn, there was just a link, no images, and I don't know if it's something you guys can change, but yeah.
No, that's actually, someone contacted us about that recently. I mean, I think something changed. And yeah, someone did contact us saying, hey man, like I use Leanpub to promote LinkedIn, to sort of promote my book. That's my main thing. And the images aren't showing up anymore. Can you please fix that? So that's actually like, I can confirm that's in our pipeline right now.
It was working for the previous book, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. I don't think it's something you've done. LinkedIn, there's like these OG meta tags at the top of the thing. They must just be more picky on what they're supporting now.
Yeah, it's something like that. But for anyone listening, by the way, please, if you ever see anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at hello@leanpub.com, because as we're talking about, like, it might be a bug on our end. It might be something that changed on our end, but all these like Mastodon, social, like, Twitter, X, whatever, they change things themselves too. So if you're a Leanpub author and you suddenly see something's not working that was working before on a third-party site, we might not be able to fix it, but we definitely want to know about it, and we'd love to hear from you about it. So please don't hesitate. Well, Paul and Luc, thank you very much for taking some time out of your evening to talk to me over here. And thank you very much for writing such a great book. It's really good, really informative. And for anyone who's sort of like felt kind of lost in all of this stuff, the book starts with history and moves you through very practical examples into understanding these really sophisticated process management concepts. And it's a very, very good example of the genre. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks, Len.
Thanks a lot.